Hi everyone, welcome to Extra Credit, and today we're going to be talking about everyone's favorite subject, dating. Now, you might be surprised to learn this, but dating is actually a crucial topic when it comes to the study of history. After all, pretty much everything in history is affected by it, and it's even going to play a pretty big role in your own life too, especially as you grow older and as time— Wait, what? No, not that kind of dating, guys. I'm talking about dating like 500 AD or 29 BC and that kind of thing. Yeah, I know, this just got a whole lot less interesting. So when it comes to studying the past, something that historians like to do to make it a bit easier is to divide history up into chunks called periods and then to give each of those periods a name. This process is sometimes called periodization, which is a fancy historian way of saying I'm too smart to talk like a normal human being. Now, as with basically everything else when it comes to the study of history, this whole process of periodization has some pretty major pros and cons, and that's what we're going to talk about today. What do you gain and what do you lose by looking at history this way? So to start with, let's take a look at ancient Egypt, for example. When we talk about Egyptian history, we usually identify three major periods, each falling within a certain time frame. There's the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. Yeah, no one ever said historians were creative. Now, the reasons why this approach is useful is pretty obvious. After all, we're talking about over 1,500 years of history just in those three time periods alone, and that's not even counting all the other periods of Egyptian history that we're not going to talk about today. Altogether, that makes up about 3,000 years of Egyptian history. 3,000 years, that's even longer than it takes my kids to brush their teeth and get ready for bed. See, without time periods like this, it would be a lot harder to keep track of certain trends, changes, and development in history. So for example, we can use periodization to help us remember that the Old Kingdom was a time when lots of pyramids were made. Pharaohs had the wealth and resources to be able to afford those kinds of massive building projects. Whereas the Middle Kingdom of Egypt was known as the time when the pharaohs showed how great they were by beating up on the small, weak, defenseless nation to the south. Okay, so Nubia wasn't actually defenseless, but still. Or in the area of religion, the Old Kingdom is dominated by a heaven-oriented mindset in which the design of the pyramid was supposed to help usher the pharaoh's soul up into the sky to join the gods. Whereas in the New Kingdom, the rich were now buried underground, meaning that their soul had to pass through the underworld and go through a series of trials before entering the afterlife. On a side note, the most famous of these trials was the so-called Hall of Judgment, in which the god Anubis would ask the dead person his name, his favorite color, and the airspeed velocity of an African swallow. No, that's a different test, actually. But anyways, as you can tell, it's much easier to break the past up into chunks like this so we can analyze the larger trends going on at the time and see how it all fits together. But what might not be as obvious is that this approach actually has some fairly major drawbacks. For starters, we have to ask ourselves the question of who gets to decide when a certain time period begins and ends. And then more importantly, how is that decision made? Take, for example, the so-called early dynastic period of ancient Egypt, which comes right before the Old Kingdom period. This period begins with the rise of a king named Narmer, who unified Upper and Lower Egypt to make it into one nation, thus kind of kick-starting Egyptian history. Now, a quick search on the early dynastic period will show you that it starts in about 3150 BC, or 3100 BC, or maybe it's 2920 BC. That's a spread of over 200 years. That would be like future school children writing on a test that Canada became a country in 2076 AD, and the teacher being like, yeah, close enough. See, the fact is that lots of the things that we study in history happened so long ago that there's just no way of nailing down a precise date. We pretty much have to just cross our fingers and hope for the best. And to add to the complexity, sometimes the start or ending of a period isn't even based on the rise of a certain figure or something specific, but it's a whole lot more general. Take the Archaic period in ancient Greece, for example. The Archaic period was a time when Greece underwent all kinds of social, political, and cultural changes that would help make it into the great civilization that we remember in the Classical period. These developments included things like a growth in population, the use of the alphabet, the rise of city-states, a change in military tactics. And the thing about these kinds of changes is that they don't just happen overnight. It's not like somebody wakes up one day and says, hey, let's start using the alphabet. Although if you're not, I do recommend it. And so for reasons like this, historians don't really know when to start the Archaic period. Some of them choose 800 BC, some of them choose 650 BC, some of them are like, 700-ish. And none of this means that historians don't know what they're doing, it just reminds us that historical dating is often really imprecise, arbitrary, and downright artificial at times. Because even when you do have a very concrete event that happens on a certain date, it doesn't mean that everything changes just because that event took place. To use another example from ancient Greece, the classical period becomes the Hellenistic period in exactly 323 BC, because that year marks the death of Alexander the Great, one of the most famous Greeks of all time, and yes, I use air quotes intentionally. You see, after Alexander died, his huge empire was broken up, and this led to all kinds of incredible historical changes across Europe and Asia. But just because his death was a really big deal doesn't mean that everything all of a sudden changed just because he died. The classical period and the Hellenistic period wouldn't have looked that different to a Greek just trying to get by. Keep in mind that for most of history, the vast majority of people have been peasants trying to make their living from the earth, and their two main concerns are the same as ours. What's for dinner and what's on TV? Or if you're in ancient Greece, what's for dinner and what's at the theater? Not like the theater that you know, but the one with stone seats and no popcorn. You see, the irony is that the types of events that historians use to mark the passage of time are things that most people at the time wouldn't have noticed or even really cared about at all. An Egyptian peasant farming his land in the New Kingdom would have had a pretty similar life to an Egyptian peasant farming his land in the Old Kingdom, regardless of whether Khufu or Ramesses was on the throne. Or most striking of all, consider the event that gave rise to this entire system of historical dating in the first place, the birth of Jesus Christ somewhere around the year 0. Jesus' birth is the benchmark by which all of history is measured, and yet at the time, almost nobody noticed it. After all, who would have really cared about a little boy being born to a poor couple in some backwater of the Roman Empire? So far as we know, just his parents and a few shepherds. And yet that was the moment when history changed forever. So in conclusion, when you're studying history, it's good to have a big picture idea of what types of changes and developments have taken place over time, and periodization can really help us get a handle on that. But at the same time, remember that numbers never tell the whole story, and when you dig a little bit deeper, you often find a whole world of complexity. So the next time you see that cute guy or girl walking down the hall, remember, you may be too young for dating, but you can always practice your dating. See what I did there? Hey everyone, thanks for watching. It's always fun to make this show. Today is the first episode in a while, and of course we are in a world that's changing every day and every week, and so we'll see what future episodes look like. Your challenge for this week is to figure out how many ages there are in the history of Middle Earth. As always, don't forget to subscribe, and have a great rest of the week. We will see you next time.